Welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast, a conversation for all things performance related, where we push the boundaries of speed, power, and strength. I'm your host, Ryan Patrick, and we're here to discuss, debate, and enhance athletic development for coaches and athletes alike. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Dr. Michelle Boland is a certified strength and conditioning coach with distinction and owner of both Reframe Performance Inc. and Michelle Boland Training. Reframe Performance Inc. is a remote coaching service that provides supportive strategies for running and hiking enthusiasts. Prior experience includes Director of Education at a private training facility and many years as a strength and conditioning coach for a D1 collegiate institution. Michelle holds a bachelor's degree in nutrition, a master's degree in strength and conditioning, and a doctoral degree in exercise physiology. She specializes in movement biomechanics, athletic development, and improving fitness and addressing nagging pain or injuries that may limit performance. Michelle also enjoys hiking and competing in trail marathons and ultramarathons. All right, so welcome, Michelle. I'm really excited to have you on today. It's been a little while since we've connected, so why don't you bring me up to speed with you? What's going on? How's the training? How's coaching? Fill me in.
all the X's and O's. So recently, I guess the big news is, so I am self-employed. I owned Michelle Boland Training, which was an LLC. And basically, it's not some grand scheme, but I moved from an LLC to a corporation, mostly for tax reasons. But in the process, they were like, hey, do you want to change your name? And I was like, yeah, actually, I do. That's a great idea. And I brainstormed for a while. And I think my biggest focus is having people like reframe, and we'll probably dive into this today. This is why, I love chatting with you so much, because helping people reframe what performance is, what physical activity is, I think is kind of what I surround myself with. And then personally, as you know, I have gotten into long distance or ultra running. So my passion for that really brings me a lot of enjoyment and like being out in the woods. So I wanted to start like a company using that new name that coaches people remotely who are enthusiasts for running and hiking. So that's pretty much my big focus moving forward. And yeah, I'm really excited about it.
That's awesome. I'm not a runner. I maybe could be, but I lived in Colorado for a couple of years for graduate school, and hiking is like my preferred outdoor activity of choice. It's just so serene. But are you talking about, do people do this as like sporting? Or are you trying to like prep people for climbing 14ers, or what is, I don't even know what this looks like.
So I want the average Joe who does it for enjoyment. I think there's a lot of the things I talk about in terms of like my website and marketing stuff is just like reframing your perspective towards things. Like people would get a little bit too obsessed with data to me and like the getting things done or checking something off. And I think it takes the enjoyment away from it. I like to work with people to get them back into doing something because they love to do it, not because they need to check off a box. So yeah, people anywhere from, their goal is to climb a 14,000 foot mountain to complete a race versus compete in a race. I think there's a huge difference there. So, average people who enjoy running and hiking, but also maybe get aches and pains from it. And maybe they can figure out ways, which is what I'm going to do, like supplement their training off the trails and off the road to really help them pursue that.
Yeah, anytime you start a new activity, whether it's a traveling hobby or picking up an instrument or some kind of cooking thing, or in this case, training, there's always this period of uncertainty of, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't even know who the right people are to filter a lot of this information, right? So you're just sitting there searching on the internet, trying to piece it together. You're joining random Facebook groups. It's so hard to synthesize something that's coherent. And I'm sure for a lot of, I'll be athletes who want to get into running, and want to get into hiking are going to encounter a lot of just orthopedic problems, understanding of how to structure their training. For the average person that you're working with, what are some of the big pitfalls that these, I think, well intentioned enthusiasts run into, no pun intended, when it comes to starting their training?
There's a lot of things. I think three big things come to my mind. One, not going through a learning process. Everything you do is a learning process. Everything is done through trial and error. And it's either win or you learn. Like you never lose doing something. And I think people don't come away after doing something and think, okay, what are the lessons that I learned from this? And I think that's where a coach really is helpful because they can guide you through that. Okay. Like going through a workout or going through a hike, what things went really well? What do you need to prepare for more? What are maybe some difficulties, both physical and mental? That is a huge thing I think people don't reflect on a lot. They just lead into the second point I'm going to make, which is just more is better. And I think we just have this attitude as a society in terms of physical activity that more is always the answer. And it's like this idea of asking ourselves to constantly like take from ourselves. And then we lose sight of giving back to ourselves. And that's what I think, I don't use the phrase like strength training. I use like weight training because the weight room can be a tool to give back to ourselves instead of take from ourselves. And I think that's a huge reframe for people. Third point I would say is getting away from like things we should be doing. This idea of, weightlifting is using a barbell. I should be doing these types of activities, or I should be hitting this certain miles per week. I think it's just looking at yourself and what your goals are, and don't have such like a tunnel vision with like things that you should be doing and having this checklist. It's more like exploration and like getting some joy out of things. So those are like my three big points I would say to that.
No, that's huge. I love the idea of gentle discovery, right? Because I have a pretty intense personality when it comes to certain things. So I'm either all in or I'm all out. And I know in some perspectives, I talk to a lot of clients about this, right? I'm like, fitness doesn't work like that, even though perhaps I might be this way in literally every other area of my life. But that domain is one that they seem to struggle with because it's almost like we set these expectations of what we're trying to do or what we feel like this process should look like. And in reality, what I feel like you're communicating is just setting good standards for yourself and releasing the expectation of what we think should happen.
Yeah, like how do you do that in the gym? Because I feel like there's this huge comparison to like everything that we do, we compare ourselves to like elite athletes, right? So, and even people coming into like your gym, they see videos online or YouTube, and it's like power lifters or Olympic weightlifters. And it's like this idea of, okay, I need to be training like that versus who I actually am, like gen population, and like learning to train a different way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think even as a coach, like I'm still sometimes have challenges with that, right? Because you maybe see what somebody else is doing. It's, oh, I should be getting my athletes on this level instead of stepping back and being like, okay, what does this person really need for the level that they're at? Right. Because there's just different levels to this. Right. And the things that are going to take you from a novice to just somebody who has a little bit of competency or an intermediate are not the same things that are taking the intermediate and making them experts or the experts and making them world class. And to be honest, the room for improvement, the higher you go, the margin is so small that
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes people, like even me, it's like we gloss over these things that are simple and fundamental and ultimately more useful to what the endeavor is than, what we see on Instagram, even though that stuff might attract athletes, right? People love the sizzle. They love
Yeah.
the fancy stuff, but I communicate this to people all the time. I think the people at the elite level, they might do some flashy stuff, but really what they do is the common things uncommonly well.
Yeah. And I think there's a huge, obviously, genetic component, but it's not as sexy as people think. We see these Instagram influencers that on recovery days, they're doing massages and ice baths and cold plunges and saunas. And elite athletes are probably just sleeping all day. Like it's not that sexy.
So true. So I want to circle back on this point that you made really quick about how everyone is comparing themselves. And I refer to it as the compare and despair trap. So just this past week, I read that the guy from Great Britain, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, just ran like it was an 8 flat 2 mile, like a couple seconds over, which is, I mean, to wrap my mind around that level of performance is absurd. I think if you look at the breakdown, most people probably couldn't run one 200-meter at that pace, let alone you're running essentially 16 of those back to back. So what are you doing to help your athletes and clients with their goals while helping them avoid this compare and despair trap?
I think it's like a perspective of showing people what they're capable of doing, but not in this competitive realm. Yeah, of course, there's definitely some people I work with who are who are very competitive. And I would say that about myself too. I actually have to learn how to not compete during races sometimes. But some people, it's just showing them what they're capable of doing. Some people can't even wrap their heads around a 5K, never be able to go to that distance, or a 10K and so on. So I think it's pulling back from not letting things like that stop you or freeze you, because you're never going to win a world record or go to the Olympics. But it's like, what do you want to do for yourself? What do you want to finish or complete or get a time for yourself? And I think that's an inward perspective versus, hey, what can I get credit for from other people, as like an outward perspective. So it's definitely this compete or complete kind of mindset. And I have that kind of question in my questionnaire of, if you're going to choose an event, and some people don't have to train for an event, do you want to compete for this, or do you just want to complete it? And that's your kind of medal right there. And I think that's two different mindsets.
Yeah, I'm getting Marie Kondo vibes, right? Does this bring you joy? Do
Yeah.
you actually enjoy doing the thing? Because, I mean, you and I talked, like we both like having some activities to pursue, and
Mhm.
in a way we are competitive, but I like to pursue excellence in whatever I do. And sometimes that can be a dangerous trap, but to me it just sounds like you're just reminding people that this is for you. This is great. You should enjoy this. It shouldn't be punitive. It shouldn't feel like a chore. And just how are you shaping that mindset? Because it's such a slippery slope to me with clients who maybe have some aversion to even starting this, or how do you get them, I guess, in a roundabout way, to just consider the possibility that they can do whatever it is they want?
I feel like I deal with people who, I'll say like the average Joe, in terms of the reason why I don't like comparisons for elite athletes is because that's their job. Whereas a lot of the people I work with, myself included, yourself included, we're not chasing these records or doing something for fame, because we have a life, we have a full-time job, we have families, and so does everyone else that I work with. Programming training has to fit in the context of our lives, and that's something that we need to learn how to do, versus those elite athletes or someone who's really trying to push to do something like that or compete in a way that becomes their life, and that's very different. So it gets overwhelming for people when they think that if they pursue this or get into a physical activity or start going to the gym, that will become their life, and that's just not going to work for them, right? So I try to fit into the mindset, okay, how can whatever is optimal is practical. So your training has to fit into like your daily life versus take it over completely. And that kind of makes things a little less overwhelming as we push forward to our goals.
Yeah, I encounter that a lot with our young athletes too, because we'll get some parents who are like, they want their kids in there 3, 4 days. I'm like, well, there's a lot of factors at play here. Like number one, they've got school and they got responsibilities there. They might have clubs they want to be involved with. They've already got obligations to the team and,
Mhm.
practice and games. And then you're adding this, and it's, oh, by the way, they just need to figure out how to be a teenager and actually socialize and like fit into this world. And so I'm like, it can quickly lead them down this path of just a lack of harmony between all these areas of their life. And for me, having kids, you're talking about recovery days before. I'm like, shit, the only recovery I'm getting is when my mom babysits the kids overnight because I can actually sleep in for once. So I think there's just so many balls in the air sometimes that we can lose sight of that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of what I was thinking as you were saying a lot of this.
No, I like that a lot. I think a programming strategy for that is I don't lay out, hey, you have to do this on Monday, you have to do this on Tuesday, so on and so forth. I basically write out option 1, option 2, option 3. And it's okay, if you wake up on Monday, you have a super stressful day at work, you don't have time to train. Maybe you'll do just a cross training day that day. As long as all the options get done in a course of a week, you can manipulate it based on what's happening in your life. And I think that's a good strategy to have with the programming as well.
Yeah, you mean you don't write periodized programs that are going to adequately predict mom of three's stress, 6 weeks down the road?
Exactly. I remember writing these like insanely long programs in grad school. And it's just, in school, all you have to do is worry about like your homework and tests. And it's just, you have no other life responsibilities whatsoever. And it's just so easy, right? And then when you get older, you're just like, the responsibilities just completely overtake you. That's just not real, like reality and realistic moving forward.
Yeah, like looking at Tudor Bompa's like quadrennial plan. I'm like, this guy's writing programs on a 4-year cycle. This is insane.
That's insane.
He's got a crystal ball or something when he sits down to the Excel sheet.
Yeah.
So I do want to touch on this programming aspect because I feel like it provides a lot of grace without being overly permissive, which I think is kind of the essence of periodization and understanding some maybe internal cues that these runners are having. Because I don't think people really understand sometimes how much of a stress to the system running can be. It is a very
Yeah.
challenging activity. But I also think the strength training side is really valuable to them. And so, how are you? What other ways are you positioning this so that they're just more likely to get it done? Because I consider myself kind of a recovering meathead. The running joke is I don't run unless it's after a Baja. Like it's kind of a tired joke at this point, but
Yeah.
it's almost like there's your lifters, there's your runners, and these two will never meet. So, in addition to this kind of agile periodization that you're using, what other ways are you getting these runners into the weight room and doing things that are really beneficial for them?
So you can't do it all. So at the end, like late in my running season, I'm doing so many weekly miles that just takes up a lot of time. So I can't spend an additional hour a day doing weight training, with my job and family and so on. So one, you need to program it more when you are doing less mileage. So off season, early on in the season, where general fitness is the priority. But then what I like to do is make things less overwhelming and make sure that what we're doing is so targeted that you don't need to do a lot of it. So I program and I call it the term micro dosing. So very short blocks of time, 20 minutes. And we're doing maybe 4 to 6 things that are exactly what you need to be doing for the adaptation that we're trying to make. I call it adaptive upside training because we're trying to make an adaptation. So there's a purpose, there's an intent with an upside. So we're trying to reduce the negative consequences as much as possible. The upside is in regards to the goal is to improve your running performance. We're not trying to improve your strength training performance. We're using this solely as a tool for your running or hiking performance. And I think that's a huge reframe or misconception of people, because they think, oh, if I'm getting better in the weight room, then I'll just get better everywhere. It's kind of the whole, you're weak or you just need to get stronger, right? So it's like, the reason why we're doing stuff in the weight room is to actually target things that you need for running. There's a lot of factors for trail running that are different from like traditional road running, that are different than, hiking demands, climbing and all that stuff. You pack gear and things like that. Road running, you're hitting the ground a different way, in a different type of ground than you are with trail running. Trail running, there's a lot of agility involved through that. And there's also a lot of movement demands. So when I go to weight train, I'm using resistance or different type of movements to restore access to range of motion. So as opposed to if I was doing like traditional barbell lifts or like Olympic lifts, I know this personally for me, and I'm not saying it applies to everyone, but the next day I would go to do something or run, my legs would be heavy. I would feel so stiff, a lot of tension through my hips. Well, that's negatively impacting my running workout. Whereas now the type of style of people learning maybe a different way, and the way I train now, that actually helps me the next day feel freedom of movement through my hips, feeling like I can push the ground away to push myself forward. So in the time demand that it requires to do that, will not only, like you said, reduce like the stress that running is putting on me, but it's also going to make me feel better for my next running workout or performance.
Yeah, I think the NSCA is going to put your certification in review after that one. No,
Yeah, for
I,
sure.
I'm
For
kidding.
sure.
This is a huge point of contention, though, because I think what you're alluding to is something that is very problematic of the strength and conditioning world at large, right? The
Yeah.
pedigree that we've gotten has been from bodybuilders and Olympic lifters and power lifters, and it's dominated by the weight room and those metrics and chasing strength. And the reality is, strength is one biomotor ability of several that we can accomplish inside of the weight room. And sometimes when you use that as the measure of interest, you really lose sight of what you're in there to accomplish. And I think you touched on that brilliantly, because even for athletes, I've seen a number of kids push the numbers, get stronger. And it's, wow, yeah, you can move 405, but like your rate of force development is horrible, man. You know what I mean?
I speak a lot at National Strength and Conditioning Association events, and sometimes I do have to be careful of going against people's beliefs too much. And I'm actually talking at an event in New York in April, and it's about strength training for runners. And it's going to be really hard for me because I'm basically going to say that, well, ask people, there's consequences to everything that you do. There's no solutions, just trade-offs. So, hey, what's the positive consequences of strength training? Or what do you think strength training is? And getting people to dive deeper into their rationales and reasons and what it's doing, but then flipping that and being like, okay, so if there's consequences to everything, that implies both negative and positive. So what are the negative consequences to that? And that's something that I think flips the table for a lot of traditional strength and conditioning coaches, because they don't believe that there's any negative consequences from that stuff. But if you think about what that's doing, so we're talking about traditional, maybe barbell lifts, we'll say deadlifts, back squats, things like a lot of axial loading, puts a lot of systemic fatigue on people. So one, in terms of runners and hikers. So now they're having maybe a lot of training volume, and then you're putting a lot of systemic fatigue on top of that. That's one issue. But when you get people stronger, quote unquote, say they lift heavier, what are you teaching them? You're teaching them how to be able to squeeze better, right? To stay still better, to compress their joints better. Now, yeah, of course, there can be improvements of force production that could definitely be a positive consequence, but a negative consequence that they could lose range of motion through their hips or their joints. So we want to really make sure we're diving in that realm. The other thing that I think, alluding to like your point of traditional thought, is let's make what we're doing in the weight room mimic what that athlete's doing. And you kind of alluded to this. There's a lot of like hockey strength conditioning coaches who just try to make everything look like a hockey stride or a hockey shot and think that, okay, like what it looks like what they're doing in the weight room, so it must be helping them on the ice. In everything, you could say every sport like that. And it's okay, like it looks like they're running, like it's definitely got to be like a step up, for example. And we have to get away with, okay, if they're running a lot, is doing kind of the same thing in the weight room helping them? Isn't that just adding kind of like that more concept or that taking concept? Viewing the weight room as something more of a give concept, of giving them things that they're not getting or giving them access to things that they'll need a little bit more, I think is a flip and a reframe for a lot of coaches.
Which is wild when you really consider it, because it's like making things like the most specific thing you can do is the activity itself. And if you're trying to make a secondary activity exactly like the first, why wouldn't you just allocate more volume to the activity in question? You're doing
Exactly.
you're
Exactly.
doing the secondary activity to acquire other benefits that you're not getting from your primary activity. And the way that I like to think about it is, for an athlete, nobody's taking a barbell out to midfield and doing curls or anything like that. So I want this to fill empty buckets, to give you things that maybe your primary activity doesn't, or to restore things that doing your primary activity takes away. And sometimes it's hard for people to break this paradigm, like this mindset that they have. So I'm like, take a magnifying glass to whatever it is, right? So if I take strength training and I magnify it all the way out to the strongest guys in the world, what are their glaring deficits? Well, they move like refrigerators. They probably have lots of joint pain. They probably are huffing and puffing walking through the airport, but they're really strong and they have huge muscles. If I do the same thing to maybe a runner and we go the other direction, well, what do the best runners in the world do? And what are the positive and negative consequences of doing this activity at the most extreme level? And I think you can start to kind of separate this, what value is. But I also think for the average person, there's a bandwidth. If you can do a lot of things without really experiencing too much, or at least a level of interference from those negative consequences.
Yeah, for sure. And to your first point, make the thing like the football is a thing, make it the thing, like what they're training for. Don't think that like the weight room is the thing. And then the second point is you also need to do that analysis with the activity of itself, which is kind of something you alluded to towards the end. It's okay, I kind of dived into the consequences of the weight room, but okay, what about running? Like what are the consequences to that? Like, yeah, positively we think of, oh, running's just the best for cardiovascular benefits, and a lot of people do it to lose weight or whatnot, burn calories or get leg strength and whatnot. Okay, what are some of the negative consequences of running? And that's, again, a lot of people don't think that way. But running, what does it do? It constantly, you're pushing yourself forward, push forward. And a lot of people's center of mass actually does get pushed forward, even statically or like positionally. Like our hips get pushed forward, like we get pushed forward over our feet. So a lot of the things you can do in the weight room is really helping people move back their center of mass. And that kind of cleans up a lot of people's hips or the negative symptoms or consequences, or maybe even like aches and pains they get from that activity.
I want to take this idea and kind of expand on it, because when I think about runners, obviously the impact is a huge concern. I think that there's a number of things that go into that. Just one, do people have the structural uh, aptitude to actually tolerate those forces? Do they have the right footwear? There's probably a plethora of things that I don't even know enough about. And I think about hikers and the knee pain of them trying to use eccentric rate of force production on the way down, and they just talk about the knees hurting. So, how do you think somebody's at the door, the dogs are home? So, how do you go about getting people to, especially those who are maybe averse or uncertain or fearful of the pain that comes with running because they've experienced that in the past? How do you get them to suspend this disbelief that they can actually do this in a way that is pain-free and enjoyable again?
Yeah. Talk about real life right there, you know? Yeah, pain's an interesting thing. At Reframe Performance, I definitely have a physical therapist named Tim Richard on staff. So if anyone's dealing specifically with they want to remove pain symptoms, he has a big running history. He's also a strength conditioning coach. So I have someone on staff to specifically work with those types of people. But of course, I have people who've had pain injuries in the past, and really it's showing them a different way to do things. First, we want to definitely look at how they're running, because that could be a huge component. Maybe they're not distributing forces properly. They may be having a lot of focal loading in certain areas like their knee or their foot, how it hits the ground and it's just putting force down a certain way. So we definitely have to look at how they're doing things, and then using the weight room to kind of really give them what they need and try to give them more movement options. And typically that really helps people move a different way. And so when they go and do, running or hiking activities, they're not experiencing those symptoms as much. They're not showing them more of the positive consequences to weight training that address the negative consequences of the running activity.
So a little more gentle discovery.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So, kind of continuing on this thought, somebody comes to you, you clean up their pain with the help of other clinicians, which I'm like secretly super jealous of that. What are some of the big levers that you've really got to pull when it comes to program design for them? I know you mentioned the kind of agile periodization, this having options, but what are some of the other factors you're thinking about for the average person that comes in?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I am definitely, I will say, lucky to have a PT on staff, because I don't want to cross the boundaries of thinking that I'm going to solve someone's pain issues. I don't have a PT behind my name, so it's nice to work with someone like that. But for general population clients, a lot of people have aches and pains. And I think using the weight room to give them more movement options and ranges of motion, and showing them different mechanics and techniques to help them distribute forces a little bit better in the weight room really helps them when they go put their bodies through a lot of force acceptance and force production cycle when they go to run. So I think it's diving deep into that analysis that we, have been talking about for a while, and really thinking about the person of being like, okay, what are maybe the restrictions or barriers that they're facing, and how can we really eliminate these so the activity doesn't push them further down like that direction.
Yeah. So to me, it sounds like a lot of, what's the term they use? Like stress inoculation, right? Giving
Yeah.
them this like graded exposure and letting them almost prove that they can manage this, and then just kind of dosing that up till they're doing the 5K they never thought they could run, or hiking the mountain they didn't think they could.
Yeah, and a lot of
Now,
this process, like you probably know, like everyone's really interested in the quick fix or like this passive process. I'll just go get, and there's nothing wrong with this stuff, but I'll go get an injection, or I'll go do like cold plunging, or I'll go do this and that. And it's, what can I do that I don't really have to work too much for? But it is an active process. It is this like exploration of what's going on in my body and taking the time to be able to like work through that yourself. And that's hard for people. It's another time demand, it's another take. But if you do the process yourself, you're going to give. So working on that give aspect is huge.
Yeah, I have a client in mind that, they love to train hard. They don't love to do all the work, do the work in, if you will, until things start hurting or something else. And we just had the conversation yesterday. And the last thing I kind of said was, this is when the long route becomes the short route, because you understand this process of managing and recovery and just balancing all of this out. Because if you try to just push the one side of the equation, you end up with more negative consequences.
Yeah, and that this is hard, but these are the type of people who do seek out coaches because they do value that and understand that. It's a little bit harder to almost prove that to someone who doesn't want it to be a process. They just want like a quick solution.
Yeah, I've shifted away from a lot of that over the years. More on programming. So one area that we're starting to dive into with our athletes is this data revolution.
Yeah.
Force plates are becoming commercially available and less cost prohibitive than in the past. There's tons of new technologies coming out. But running has always had, a strong representation in terms of research and exercise physiology.
Mhm.
We had metabolic carts. There's so much on heart rate training. I feel like it was really one of the first types of activities, and probably because there's fewer constraints to it than, say, a team sport athlete who may run, sprint, walk, whatever. But I know that this, like, even thinking back to Nike's like Chasing Two, right? They had a whole team of exercise physiologists, which actually I went to graduate school with one of the guys who was part of that and got to like pace on the bike for Kipchoge. Well, yeah, which was super cool. But that can also be super tricky because I'm sure people are buying Whoop bands and the Aura rings and they've got heart rate monitors. So I guess what I want to know is, what role is the data playing in your coaching process? When does it become interference, and when do you feel like it really has value for the people that you're working with?
So I think data has value if you're using it. Otherwise, I think a lot of it is a little overplayed. And also, the more objective data we have, I think we value subjective data less. So I really want people to get into attuning to how they feel and attuning to their body. So they're not so reliant on being told by a watch or a ring how they're feeling. And it's okay, like if there's a match between your subjective data and objective data, we have a good thing going, we have a good sign. But if someone wakes up in the morning and feels awesome and great, but then their Oura ring is saying they had a bad night's sleep and they shouldn't train today, we have a little bit of a problem. And especially if it's affecting them mentally as well. I'm a little bit more biased to being as little data as possible. So only picking something that we really need. There's two aspects to like data collection. And one, I think the running world is obsessed now with like apps like Strava. Like I get asked all the time, like, why don't you have a Strava account? That would be a great avenue for people to like see your training. And my first response to that is, well, my training's not for other people, it's for me. And I think that's lost in the social media world as well. But also, too, I don't want people knowing my location. That's also something that needs to be considered. And I don't think people think about that. But I wear a Garmin GPS watch, and there's for many few reasons. One, it has a safety thing. If anything happens to me, it sends my GPS location to a few people, which I think is pretty cool. And I track certain data points. I really only track maybe three. One of them is elevation gain when it gets later into the season. And when I have a big race, elevation gain is a big training point for me. And then also, I've noticed a lot, it matches how I feel sometimes when I'm overtraining and I can see the numbers. And I'm like, this is absolutely matching my subjective feelings. So I need to address this. But overall, I think we can get too lost with the coolness and sexiness of technology. And that's why I'm really in my coaching trying to pull people back almost away from that, to do it because they enjoy it and to really connect with how they feel through it as like an experience versus just focusing on like the numbers. That's my like personal bias towards that.
You know, it's so funny, and just hearing you talk about this and some of the elite athletes we've had is that they're less concerned. Like, they
Yeah.
like seeing their GPS data, they like seeing certain things, but they have a certain felt sense about
Mhm.
activities or doing certain things that they know I don't really care if they're science. Like, we've got a guy, an NFL guy, and he loves sand. And I'm not going to argue with him about whether sand's good or not good for speed, because when he does it, he just knows, like, for him, there's something about that, right? So on one hand, you've got people who are, we don't want to compare to the athletes, but we're trying to also use this objective data, when in reality, some of these guys at the highest level are just in tune with their bodies. They're in tune with the way things actually feel, and get this whole subjective sense. So it's like that aspect they need more of, and less of the expectations, objective outputs, and all these other things that we're using as standards that at the end of the day may or may not be relevant to the person in question. And I'll use myself as an example. I had the Whoop band and the Aura at one point, and it would tell me, you're amber or red today. You didn't sleep as well. And I would be like, want to bet? So I would go probably the whole opposite direction, just like to get competitive with the software. And for most people, it shouldn't be the law and order of your training, but instead an indication. And for me, when I was down, it was like, you ate too late. You didn't recover
Mhm.
as much as you needed to. Your sleep was a little short. It wasn't like this. My body was in a tailspin, and it was, it would show up red one day. But that's when you look at a trend over time, you just see where there's little inconsistencies that actually drive you to better decision making. But it's hard to get to that place and not use it as, oh, well, I can't train today.
Yeah, I think just because we have access to it doesn't mean we should use it. Again, it's going back to this you should concept, right? And the whole comparison between elite athletes and gen pop people, of like people who are competing, and we see the NBA and how sexy that is and how much technology they use. But like you said before, every like centimeter matters for those types of athletes. Whereas like people who are just trying to complete things, or, find a good activity or enjoy activity, it's just they don't need that as much. And I think sometimes coaches get into that stuff because they almost want to prove their value in a certain way, um, versus the actual benefit for the client to just have a conversation and gain subjective data, because I think that is underrated in its value.
Where do you see this going in the next 3 to 5 years? Because I feel like there have always been, you and I have been in the industry long enough now. We've seen some trends, right? So more recently, I think this data revolution is the big thing now. And you're seeing a lot of coaches get sucked into it. And there will probably be coaches that go too far into it.
Mhm.
5, 10 years ago, everybody was doing the functional movement screen. We were worried about all this nuance of, 5 degrees of hip rotation one way or the other. And that could be a dangerous rabbit hole. Back before then, I don't know what guys were doing. There was probably something, maybe I feel like it was almost bodybuilding was the thing, then powerlifting, then Olympic lifting. Then we got control of all those. And that's when it became more about the functional movement. But all that said, is as an industry, and with specific to where you are, like, what do you think is going to be some of the big trends, or what will be some of the major evolutions you anticipate in the next couple of years?
Next couple of years, I think it's just going to get on the worse on the path that it is. And I shouldn't say worse because that implies negative, but I think it's just going to keep going basically, because more is just going to come out, and you're seeing more companies being developed for like data analysis, data collection, just in like the CrossFit realm. I rent space from a CrossFit gym sometimes, and they have some signs or companies that come in want to collect data for like WODs and things like that. I think it's just going to keep building in data collection. Data itself, I think, has more value right now than the technology itself. I know companies like Whoop and all that stuff are really trying to expand their data analysis. So I just think it's just going to keep growing and probably create a whole new field in terms of the exercise realm, because just like there's software developers and coding, I think that's going to bleed over into exercise science. I think you're going to see a lot more like exercise scientists and people who are just dealing with the technology and data collection. So that might change how things go.
We're going to have just an epidemic explosion of people who are savvy with Google Sheets in our field.
What about you? Do you think the same thing, or do you think it's going to go a different way?
No, I'm with you. I think we're just at the forefront of this. I mean, we're seeing more technologies, and I'm of the mindset, if I'm going to use something, I want it to kind of be the gold standard. I don't want to
Mhm.
use an algorithm that's 3 or 4 generations from what the actual thing is, because
Mhm.
at the end of the day, less is probably more. And I need a couple things to make some really important informed decisions about the way things are going, what the trends look like. But I mean, I'll admit it's a slippery slope. It's very seductive. I
Yeah.
think exactly to your point of coaches wanting to prove value. I think it's intellectually stimulating. So from that perspective, it's kind of fun because I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think our job is that difficult. At the end of the day, if we're implementing simple things at a high level, most people are going to get results. And I get a ton of data, and now I got to coach up a split squat. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know how all that really transfers. So
Yeah,
I think,
like you said, there's two different perspectives. It's kind of good for if you've had someone for 3 years, they can look back what they did, right? And that could be a huge positive feedback. I think a huge problem will be it's this constant comparison to elite people, because just for that CrossFit example, they're going to collect an insane amount of data of elite CrossFitters. Then in the same app, there's probably going to be things like, hey, Michelle, your WOD today is this many points away, or this comparison from Matt Frazier. And you're just going to be like, what? You know what I mean? And it's just constant, I'm never good enough kind of thing. And I need to do more, or this isn't achievable. And it's, well, you're just comparing yourself to the wrong thing.
yeah, back to your point of, right, don't shit on yourself. It's what could you do? And is it congruent with the rest of your life?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start wrapping up here. There's a lot of coaches. I mean, we've already kind of mentioned the pedigree of this field, where a lot of guys come from, but they're unlikely to have a ton of experience with running, and I'll include myself in
Yeah.
that. So, what do we need to know about just at a surface level, the demands of running, the mindsets of runners, and the training when it comes to this population?
Touching on the mindset, I think runners are known to be a little like quirky or like crazy in some ways. Especially like running cross country in college, I would probably agree with that. um, we're probably similar to like soccer players in regards to it's probably hard to like prove the value in like weight training, because people who do endurance type stuff like running sometimes just can't see the value. So I would probably say showing them a different way to train than what they perceive as what the expectation is would probably benefit you in a lot of ways. And focusing on movement instead of loading is probably the best thing for them. Those are kind of my simple hitters, I would say, to just keep in mind. And I feel like we touched on a lot of diving into the needs analysis of looking at both the positive and negative things that come from the activity itself, and also like weight room activity.
Yeah, I think you did a bang up job on that before. And as far as mindset, I'm convinced we're all just a little bit weird. It's just who lets other people know about it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Okay, so just some fun stuff. Are there any tools or ideas that you've circled back around on? Maybe you weren't doing it or using it for a while and it's just found its way back.
Found its way back. I mean, I would just say running in general. I was a huge, and a lot of people know this about me, is I was a huge runner in college. So like I played college soccer for 4 years, but then I would always go and practice with the cross country team or track team on like weekends or even after soccer practice. And trail running and all that stuff. And I fell off and I went to grad school for strength conditioning, and it was all about weights, weightlifting, even in CrossFit type of stuff. So I've always had a big engine, but getting back into running, and we were talking about this off air a little bit, but it's adds such a personal enjoyment for me that I really am like swung back on, okay, like what's going to really give me enjoyment throughout my day, or like what I'm going to look forward to. So I'm glad that has come back and shown itself a little bit.
Very cool. All right. I want to direct people to some of your best content. So is there a post or a video that you have that everyone should go search for right now? And I'll link it in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. So I say I'm not much of a social media person, but now I have 3 accounts, so I don't know how that happened. One account I have is for the Boston Health Performance Summit, which I put on every year. This is June 8th and 9th this year. And then my Reframe Performance account, I think it's pinned at the top, but it's reframing like weight training as tension training. And I talk about how all we're doing when we weight train is manipulating the amount of tension we hold in our bodies in certain areas. And thinking of weight training like that removes that strength training concept of just the more is better and just load is better. And I think it really helps you look at I do a lot of videos with running, and we talk about at certain times you have tension, then you need to release it, tension, release it. If you constantly have tension, you're restricting motion and things like that. So that was a fairly decent post. And then on my Michelle Boland account, I've gotten a lot of positive feedbacks on posts that look at 2 different exercises, and I say, hey, what things can you notice here? And then I explain my rationale for the differences. So I think there's a bench press one with my feet on the ground versus on the bench. So that was probably my most popular one.
Awesome. All right. What's your training looking like?
So my training is very early on in the season. So it is February right now. So I just really started to dive into getting back to running. I took a little bit of an off season in the winter. So now I'm just focused on like general fitness. I'm weight training, but only for 30 minutes, just doing what I need to do 3 days a week. I'm averaging a certain mileage per week. And 1 day a week, I'm spending a long duration of time on my feet. So I'll go out in the woods, run, jog, hike, probably with one of my dogs for a few hours. What I'm working towards and what I'm building towards is 6 months away. So I have a patience problem. So I'm really focusing on making sure I'm not pushing too much too soon. I'm doing a trail marathon in April, which is, I mean, my competitive side, I'll probably try to win, but I need to pull back and not try to do that. But then I'm doing a training camp in May in Colorado for a few days. And my big thing is August. I'm doing 100K in the Swiss Alps. So that's what I got my mind on.
Yo, that'll be so cool.
It's going to be so awesome.
Oh man, you're gonna parlay a little vacation in there too, right?
Yeah, we're like, after that, we're going to go down to Italy and Spain for a week after that.
Okay. Yeah, we got an Italy trip planned this year. It's our first time going out of the country, and we are just amped. But a client of mine actually had a video. They took a train from somewhere. It went through the Swiss Alps and then down into Italy. And I mean, some of the views and the videos are just
Crazy.
absurd. But man, 100K, like that's nuts.
Yeah. It's not even the distance. Like I feel pretty confident in the distance. It's the elevation game that's a whole different ball game. It's like over 33,000 feet of elevation gain. So that's a whole different thing in and of itself.
What's the highest elevation you'll actually be running at?
It's actually not that bad. I think it's like close to 9,000.
It's noticeable.
Yeah, it's noticeable, but it's not like 14,000. I mean, I'd be in the clouds then, but
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool, man. I'm excited for you. Okay, so what's next for Coach Bo? Obviously the run, but professionally, what's next for you?
yeah, so I'm really diving into more of the remote coaching for Reframe Performance. So if anyone has any questions or knows anyone who, wants some guidance for running and hiking enthusiasts, I say, that will be my biggest focus this year is trying to grow and build that. And then, like I said, I have the Boston Health and Performance Summit where, physical therapists, strength coaches, personal trainers, I put on a big educational, very practical, hands-on 2-day seminar June 8th and 9th. So that's a big focus moving forward too.
Awesome, man. Well, you've been amazing today. This was an awesome conversation. I learned a lot just by chatting with you. So thank you for honoring me with your time. I know it's hard to come by, but just one more time, if you could, where's the best place to find you on the socials? If you could list off those handles one more time.
Yeah, first off, Ryan, you're the best. You're one of the best in the business. Nicest guy too. My social media is at reframe_performance and at dr.michelleboland.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you today, and hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate and review us with 5 stars only. Then subscribe so you can get all the latest updates.